Welcome. Let's do academic writing 4. Now, at the end of the last video, I did say that I was pretty much done with these, but obviously I'm not. Here we are with number 4, and number 5 I'm going to record straight after as well. As with all these sort of things, when I present them to my students or have discussions with people, more questions follow. And the main question that came up was around meaningful coherence, what that means in more detail, and some kind of specifics about how we can go and do it. Now, with my students and people that I work with closely, that's quite easy, isn't it? Because I can give them specific ideas about what is a meaningful coherence for their work. And once you have that specific case study or area that you're looking at, it's quite easy. So I'm going to try and present some stuff today in a kind of general sense, which is still a way of developing meaningful coherence. In the 2 videos, that is. So this one I'll kind of just talk around it a little bit more and flesh it out. The second video I'll set it up a little bit more detail. So just to take a backward step, this is something that maybe I should have discussed a little bit more in the first video. And it's just a reorganization of the way that you think about writing. So the first thing is to stop thinking about academic writing as writing. So the reason I say that is that I'm not very good at writing. I never was very good at writing. I'm not greatest at spelling. I'm not the greatest at grammar. But I can academically write. I have learned that skill over time. It used to be that when I was younger, people would have to proofread my work for me. My sisters, my mum, they would help me with that sort of stuff. And that's shifted now in that I still have to sometimes really focus on my proofreading, which I talked about in the last video. But the way in which you deliver the analysis, the way that you develop academic writing, doesn't rely on the spelling. The spelling you can get. You know, anyone can learn to spell in the end if you put enough hours into it. But actually moving into academic writing takes something different. And I think it's worth just saying, okay, it's not writing. Just because you can write doesn't mean to say you can academically write, because it's not writing. It's something else. So what is it? And the way I try and kind of understand this is that it's high level thinking, which you have to translate into black and white on paper. So that translation shows the ordering of what's most important. The high level thinking is the most important. The translation of that is obviously important, but unless you have the high level thinking, the thoughts, the ideas, the evidence, the translation of it doesn't matter. You know, if you have bad thoughts, ideas, and evidence, then translating it doesn't matter how well it's spelt or what grammar is. The translation doesn't matter. So with that in mind, you start to kind of reorganize your way of considering this. It helps you to think, okay, I can write. I'm a writer. I can write, but that doesn't mean to say you can academically write. So now you start to understand that you're a beginner. And if you are a beginner, and even if you've passed an undergrad degree, there may be people who need to still develop their academic writing when they get into masters and PhD, and then again when they start writing academic papers. These are all steps up the ladder. A kind of useful analogy for this, for anybody who likes a bit of comedy, is the difference between Stuart Lee and Michael McIntyre. And if you know Stuart Lee's comedy, you'll understand what I'm talking about. A considered, thoughtful assessment of an idea, which is plotted over the course of his performance, over the course of your essay or your literature review, which has callbacks and reference points and interesting analysis along the way. Whereas Michael McIntyre, well, I won't characterize his comedy because I'm not being mean, but let's just say it's not at the highest order in comparison. It's not of the same order of intelligence or development as Stuart Lee's. So anyway, if you want to go and have a look at Stuart Lee's comedy, you'll see what I'm getting at. And you'll probably hate it as well, which is a joke that you'll get if you have watched Stuart Lee. Anyway, number 2. So to get this notion, to develop this notion of academic writing, if we're not understanding it as writing, it opens us up to now think about a new version of what writing looks like. So normally, you know, a story starts with in the beginning and it ends with the end, and there's this kind of linear process. But actually, as I've kind of hinted to in some of the previous videos, writing becomes something else. It's a cyclical process. It's round and round and back again, and then repeating and re-editing and all this sort of stuff. And it's much better to think about writing as a cycle, really. And what that cycle requires is deep reading and thinking first. The kind of the first stage of writing is reading, And that's something that is lost on people, especially when I'm having these conversations with undergraduates about developing their academic writing. And they may send me something and it's very clear they've not done the reading. So any of my feedback about the writing is lost. Like, what's the point feeding back about the writing when the thinking isn't there anyway? So it goes back to my first point, doesn't it? Around this notion of the translation is important, yes, but only after the thinking of the ideas and the depth of the ideas is there. So we need the reading, we need the thinking, and then we do need to get into the writing. We do need to shut up thinking and shut up planning and start writing. Once we've done that, we probably revisit the thinking, we revisit the writing. My way of doing this personally, I spend a lot of time setting up my writing by reading something one day, allow myself to think about it even subconsciously and not actually engage in it when I'm walking the dog or listening to music. And then the next day, again, after walking the dog and thinking about those ideas more consciously, I might try and write. That works for me quite well. The kind of headspace, I hate that word, the time and the effort that I can put into giving myself that room to read and think allows me then to write much more fluidly the next day. And again, I tend to not write anymore as in type. I tend to just record notes into my phone and then edit them and make them better over time. That process is this, again, I'll go back to readings again and go back to the thinking, and that time of rotating round and thinking with the ideas and writing about them and trying to write about them, realizing the writing didn't work. It's showing something about the process. It's not a linear process. It's a circular process. And it has an element of it's almost more like an art form than it is, the kind of simple linguistic translation of ideas. There's a kind of an artistic process to it, I think. It's a nicer way of thinking about it. But this is hard, though. People sometimes don't like to think deeply. When you're following an idea and it's there and it's kind of almost there, and then it evaporates again. That can be quite uncomfortable. I liken it to when you've had a few beers and you're having a conversation and you notice the conversation has just twisted off and you can't remember where you started. But that's what happens when you're sober and you're trying to do academic thinking. Alex Channon, my good friend and colleague, talks about it as thinking round corners, trying to think around a corner. What is round that corner there? And you can see a bit and you can guess a bit. You've got to write it, though. You've got to write it down and have a go at it and then think about it again. Okay, if I put that sentence together, is that sentence neat and tidy, or if I put too many caveats into it? That process is long-term, repetitive, cyclical, very frustrating at times. But it has to be that way to be able to kind of develop the depth of the ideas. Then the final one that we'll talk about today is the academic thread, or the thread of analysis, or the theoretical thread, or the empirical thread. What is the thread that runs through whatever it is you're writing? Now, if it's an essay, it's relatively simple to have that. You can set it up at the beginning. Your essay is on a specific topic, and you can really make sure that you don't differentiate from that, and you stay focused on it. But the point of a thread is to think about it as something that eventually you're going to pull on. Now, there might be multiple threads within a piece of writing, but eventually you're going to pull on the thread. And the pulling of the thread is when you pull it all together at the end, in the conclusion. That academic thread has to be there. It has to be set up at the start. It has to continue all the way through. And you have to be able to pull it, tie it into a nice bow, and then present that academic argument. All that I've talked about there is this notion of meaningful coherence, which is set up, I think, in probably the second video. I think might be wrong there. So meaningful coherence, all those points are kind of like trying to develop what that is. The next video I'm just going to go and record now, which will be uploaded after this one, is about doing meaningful coherence. Okay, so we can intellectualize it as much as we can, and we can talk about it abstractly, but I'm going to try and set out what are the steps which I might prescribe to somebody to do to develop a meaningful coherence in their essay. Okay, I hope that's been useful. Check out the next video, and if you haven't seen the previous ones, go and have a look at them. Cheers.